Hello everyone, and welcome to this RSK Biocensus First Thursday Club webinar. I'm Des Delahaye, I'm a director here at RSK Biocensus, and it is my great pleasure to be hosting today's presentation, which is on bird surveys, impacts and mitigation by George Wilkinson. But before I introduce George properly, I'm just going to run through a couple of housekeeping announcements. So the first thing to notice is that your microphones are all turned off. That's not because we don't want to hear from you though. If you've got any comments, any questions, then please pop them in the chat. We'll have a short question and answer session at the end, and we'll hope to whiz through as many of those as possible. And those that we don't get around to, we'll try to answer by email. And then just finally, we are sending out a link shortly after this webinar to everyone who's called in, just to get a little bit of feedback, which will help us to improve our offerings in the future. So moving on to the main event. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to George Wilkinson. George is a senior consultant here at Biocensus. He has deep expertise in ornithology. He's our go-to person for any sort of technical advice on surveys, on likely impacts of developments, and on mitigation strategies. So George is also a very keen ornithologist in his spare time. So I can attest to his level of expertise and his enthusiasm for the subject, as I've worked with him on several projects before. So over to you, George.
Thanks very much, Des. Right, I'll turn my camera off. I can see Des has done the same. So great. Thanks very much, Des, for the warm welcome. Thank you, everyone, for taking time out of, I'm sure, very busy schedules. Those of you who know me will know that I normally start talking about birds anyway, whether invited or not. So it's great for once to be invited, and hope to convey my enthusiasm on this field and what I've learned in my time in the industry. I appreciate today that I'll be joined by a mix of probably some ornithologists, ecologists interested in other disciplines as well, possibly some people involved in development and other stakeholders. So within this webinar, I hope to provide an overview of ornithology. I'd like to raise awareness and interest in this field. So apologies if some of the content is familiar, but hopefully a lot of it is useful to you. I should also add that I'm a very keen wildlife photographer. So the photos in this webinar are taken by me, unless of course I'm in them. So I'm going to start by talking about why us as ecologists or as developers must consider impacts on birds. So in particular, why are they important? And then go through how we should account for birds during projects. So thinking about key sources of information, how we survey, including some emerging approaches, how and why the methods might vary. And then we're going to go through some impacts and mitigation, including some scenarios that many of you will encounter. But before all that, I'm going to talk briefly about why birds matter. So why do we need to account for them? And when thinking about this question, a few key topics came to mind. I've listed a few here, and I'm going to delve into some of them in a bit more detail. So as many of you will be aware, birds are hugely ecologically important. They're very diverse in their ecological functions and niches. They act as predators and prey, as pollinators, dispersers, habitat creators and modifiers. Many what we refer to as keystone species, so birds like the jay in the top left, which will cache I think about 5,000 acorns per year per bird. So that's an amazing impact in its role in dispersing oak. Obviously a key habitat, oak woodland and parkland for many species. Birds have great cultural importance, and I think that's exemplified by the 1.2 million RSPB members that we have, which is an amazing number. And this gives many bird species a role as flagship species to drive the conservation of other habitats and species. And two lovely examples here from recent high-profile reintroductions. Some of you may have been lucky enough to see the great bustards and the white storks. And this is relevant to us because so many people know about birds and care about birds. So often they will be an easy target for objectors, perhaps, or people to raise concerns about plans and projects and their impacts on birds. So it's important that we understand these issues and can reconcile them with stakeholders. Another key reason why we need to think about impacts on birds is the well-publicised, widespread and dramatic decline that they've gone through. So in the UK, some 28 species have declined by over 50% in the last 30 to 50 years. Many of them are farmland species, like this lovely yellow wagtail singing in the bottom right. And these farmland species, I think, are really interesting to us because a lot of our projects, particularly those that I work on, I'm sure many of you as well, are housing and solar farm projects in lowland farmland. So we're in a really interesting position where hopefully we can help reverse the fortunes of these species. It's important for us to consider birds because they occur in a really wide range of habitats, almost all habitats you can think of. And there will indeed normally be some ornithological interest at the site that you're dealing with. And these bird features could be highly varied and they could be quite unexpected. So if you look at these couple of pictures and start thinking about potential constraints, I'm sure many of you can think of bird species that might be present at different times of year. And I'm sure if you're on site, you'd think that we need to examine this in more detail, maybe further surveys and impact assessment. But what about these sites? Imagine if you were involved in the development of these, or perhaps you were the ecologist on an initial walkover survey. Would you immediately think that birds might be a potential issue, something that requires further surveys, or would you perhaps dismiss impacts? So as you've probably gathered from the way I phrased that, those sites indeed all supported important bird features that we needed to think about in the project context. So you can see 3 breeding Schedule 1 species that we had. So black redstart in that tower block in central London, also barn owl and hobby. And then the bottom left, those playing fields supported an important population of Brent goose relevant to a nearby SPA. So if we'd not considered these, perhaps deemed that the habitats were unsuitable, not fully understood the bird species that could be present, there could have been several ramifications. We could have had an adverse effect on those birds. We could have potentially breached legislation. We could have caused a development delay or additional expense, or perhaps reduced confidence in our work and in our quality as consultants. So it's really important that we consider the breadth of constraints that birds might pose. And I guess particularly why we're here is because birds can be affected heavily by plans and projects. They can have a range of impacts, which we'll look at later, and these can cause adverse effects, local and regional population declines, and maybe even local extinctions in some cases. So hopefully we agree this is an issue because, as we've established, birds are important, but also it matters to us as consultants or developers because of legislation and planning policy. So I won't go into too much detail, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but just to reiterate, we have the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which protects all birds, their nests and eggs against killing, injuring and destruction. This is from the point of the nest being built, and that's irrespective of the scarcity of that species. And then we also have species included on Schedule 1, which are afforded special protection against intentional and reckless disturbance when they're breeding. So again, this occurs from nest building until when the young are no longer dependent. So that's a key point to note there, in that therefore they could be protected against disturbance for quite a long time after they leave the nest, or potentially away from the nest site. So thinking about a species like peregrine, where the young might be dependent for 2 months or so. Schedule 1, as you'd imagine, generally covers scarcer species, but there are some that are frequently encountered at development sites. I've mentioned peregrine there. We often handle species like barn owl, kingfisher, red kite, peregrine. Chetty's warbler is an increasingly widespread one that many of you will be familiar with. I should reiterate that Schedule 1 affords this protection against disturbance when the species is breeding only. So non-breeding species, so ones like redwing and fieldfare, which will be present at many of your sites, but not breeding generally, they're not protected against disturbance at that time. To touch briefly on the Birds Directive, which is transposed by the Conservation of Habitats and Species regulations. So species included on Annex 1 are those for which the government's required to designate land for the survival and reproduction of those species, which is designated as SPAs, Special Protection Areas. And these sites together form part of the National Site Network and are therefore often an HRA issue, together with Ramsar sites, so wetland sites that can also be designated for, among other things, important bird features. We also have around 50 bird species of principal importance under the NERC Act, so those species are a material consideration within the planning process. And that includes, again, a lot of common and widespread, but potentially vulnerable and declining species like skylark, starling, and house sparrow. We also need to bear in mind planning policy at this stage. Again, not to go into too much detail, but we have the National Planning Policy Framework, which specifies obligations regarding protected species, which obviously includes birds, and also obligations regarding statutory designated sites. And then we'll also have some regional planning policy and guidance, sometimes in the form of local strategies or biodiversity action plans, and they might often draw out particular bird species or species assemblages that need considering within plans and projects. At this point, I should also give a nod to the Birds of Conservation Concern list, which is reviewed or revised every 5 years by the BTO and the RSPB, which categorises species according to their level of decline or conservation concern. So I should emphasise this isn't formal legislation or guidance, but it can be used to inform consideration of species which might be susceptible to impacts or require conservation measures. So you can see a species from each of the categories. Red list as the greatest conservation concern. Got a lovely tree sparrow in the top left. Top right is possibly one of our more overlooked species, stock dove, which is an amber list species. I've included water rail as a green list species, just to emphasise that the listing doesn't necessarily confer scarcity. So obviously water rail isn't that common a species, but is green listed because it's not deemed to be of conservation concern. And non-native species like ringneck parakeet aren't afforded red, amber or green list status. So hopefully now we know why we need to consider impacts on birds. So let's explore how we'd go about doing that in a development context. And I had to include lapwing, as I'm guessing a lot of people's favourite bird. So I guess the first question is, when do we need to consider birds? And I guess the simple answer to this is early on during the project, during the design phase, and then throughout the project stages. So impacts are often most pronounced during construction or operation. But we need to bear in mind that surveys can take specific times of year, often multiple years in the case of certain projects. So we need to seek advice early. If you seek advice quite late, say near design freeze, and then we identify a key constraint, like say the presence of a sensitive nest, say hen harrier near a wind turbine, then it could be very difficult to avoid impacts or acceptably mitigate for those. So we need to consider them early on, involve experts in the process to achieve a solution. So a first step of most disciplines, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, would be a desk-based review and possibly a field scoping exercise in the form of an initial walkover survey or a preliminary ecological appraisal. There's lots of information sources. I've listed some of them here. I won't go into too much detail, but there's a wealth of information together which we'd use to try and answer a couple of key questions at this early stage. So I guess which species have been recorded within or adjacent to our site, thinking about those Schedule 1 species, red and amber listed species, NERC species of principal importance, and then also thinking about nearby relevant designated sites. So are there nearby special protection areas, Ramsar sites, triple SIs with bird features that could be relevant to our project? The initial walkover survey is obviously a key first step. And within this, and I'm sure many of you undertake those surveys, we need to be thinking about which species of bird could occur within or adjacent to our site and could potentially pose a development constraint. And hopefully this webinar provides some food for thought on that. So together, this initial scoping desk-based review will inform the surveys that we deem to be required. There will normally be three, I guess, main driving factors for whether we need to undertake surveys and what they are. So I guess the first one is, could there be significant impacts on a population of a particular species or group of species? These impacts could be significant at a local, regional, or maybe even a national level. Is there potential for impacts on legally protected species? So thinking about those species protected against disturbance under Schedule 1. And finally, is there potential for impacts on birds relevant to nearby designated sites, as I've mentioned? We should flag that these impacts could occur on birds that are physically within the designated site, or particularly in the case of our internationally designated sites, could the impacts be on birds that are moving between land within the designated site boundary and the wider landscape? And that land within the wider landscape that's used by those birds is typically termed functionally linked land, which is a term you may well have come across. So those obviously are key considerations when undertaking HRA. So now that we've decided that surveys are required, I'm going to talk through some of the standard survey methods. I say standard in inverted commas because there often needs to be a level of specificity, which we'll talk about. There are also some more tailored survey methods, which I'm going to mention briefly, and talk about some of the factors why we might vary our approach, including some emerging approaches. So the key piece of guidance here, which many of you will be familiar with, particularly if you attended Tim's excellent presentation a few years ago, are the bird survey guidelines, which provide a unified, consistent approach between obviously different consultants and for similar projects. So these provide really detailed information on survey approaches. It gives context on when you can vary these approaches, and they are updated and discussed continually, particularly with these emerging survey methods. So there can be lots of bird survey types, but to keep things simple, we can broadly define them by the time of year. So many of you will be familiar with surveys for breeding birds or surveys for non-breeding birds. That tends to encompass wintering bird surveys, but also sometimes surveys for passage birds on spring or autumn migration. Within those two broad categories, the methods might be specific to a certain species or group of species, or to a particular habitat type, which means that the survey methods need to be tailored to it. Or the survey methods might be specific to a particular development that has certain impacts that we need to understand. So a good example of this are wind farms or overhead lines, which have bespoke survey guidance. So to run through the standard breeding bird survey approach, which is a series of 6 typically dawn visits undertaken between March and July. These, as you'd imagine, often start very early. So sometimes maybe you're out at 4 in the morning. So we need to think about that from a logistical and health and safety standpoint as well. The guidance recommends at least one of those 6 visits is a dusk visit for species that are more active in the evenings. So maybe owls, maybe woodcock, species like that. And the survey involves walking a slow route, sometimes referred to as a transect route, throughout the site, mapping all birds that you encounter and recording their behaviour, with particular emphasis on any breeding evidence. So that might be birds that are singing, pairs of birds in suitable breeding habitat, or maybe even if you encounter a nest site. So surveys for non-breeding birds, these include our wintering bird surveys, are generally similar in approach. So it's a slow walked route through suitable habitat, recording and mapping the bird activity. Particularly this time, you're looking at aggregations of birds. So often it's larger flocks that might be roosting or foraging, or groups of birds that are flying through your site, particularly thinking about those wind farm projects and overhead line projects. This time it's generally 4 visits, 1 per month, between November and February, at a range of times of day. So you're not constrained to dawn this time. It's more about choosing times that suit the target species on your site. And if you're surveying near the coast, then you might want to consider tide times that might affect when your birds are using your site. I should add at this point that we're, I think, very good, or often very good, at scheduling surveys at the peak ecology survey season, getting surveys mobilised for April and May. But because wintering surveys are outside of that period, often they can be commenced maybe in January or even February. And then sometimes people take the approach then completing those visits, say January and February, and then the following November and December. Obviously, that's something that we want to avoid. We want to be surveying through a continuous winter period, as those preceding weather conditions, both at your site and in the wider area and perhaps elsewhere on their migration route, maybe even in other countries, that will affect bird behaviour. So we want a continuous winter period. As I alluded to, there are some specific survey methods which often are targeted to particular habitats. I've shown some of them here. So for example, wader-specific survey methods for upland and lowland sites. And there's some really good species-specific guidance. So many of you will be familiar with the Gilbert book on bird monitoring methods, which has really detailed information, particularly for a lot of our Schedule 1 species, which we might need targeted surveys for. The Raptor Guide for Surveys and Monitoring also is a really, really good resource, has a wealth of information, not only on survey methods, but also on species ecology and breeding timings, which is very useful when it comes to nest monitoring. And at this point, I should also mention some of our more emerging survey methods. So I appreciate nocturnal surveys are not necessarily a new thing, but they do seem to be increasingly required, say for wintering farmland surveys, for waders near special protection areas is a common target. And there it'll generally involve surveyors obviously out at night using thermal scopes. So the increased availability and affordability of this technology has made these surveys much more possible and therefore possibly much more widespread. But these nocturnal surveys using thermal scopes can also be used during the breeding season. So I'm sure some species spring to mind: nightjar, stone curlew, owls. The thermal technology can also be used with drones, which indeed can be highly effective for inaccessible areas, or for areas where the nest can't be viewed, say there isn't a clear vantage point through to your area you're surveying. So these can have really good applications, but there are a few factors that need considering, and you often want to consult someone really experienced. So obviously the species, some species, these techniques are more appropriate than others, particularly thinking about species that nest in open areas where they're not obstructed by vegetation, which might hinder recording using a drone. The time of day, so if you're surveying later in the day, the hotter temperatures may make picking up the heat signature of a bird more difficult. If you're working near potentially sensitive public sites, maybe airfields or Ministry of Defence sites, obviously security is going to be an issue and you may find drone surveys problematic. And also thinking about disturbance as a key issue, not only of your target species, but also of other birds and potentially other wildlife too. And indeed, you may need a survey license for undertaking these surveys. And finally, acoustic surveys. This has been a developing field, and there's some really good new guidance in the bird survey guidelines for that. So much like established BAT methods, we can now leave out static detectors, sometimes for a period of several weeks. So these can record, obviously, for a much longer period than a surveyor might be on site for, and could be good for recording species which might otherwise be missed. So some quite cryptic species like hawfinch, lesser spotted woodpecker might be good examples of that. We could use them for a range of different applications. So we could think about specific species that we might want to identify presence of, like maybe nightjar or bittern, or we might use them to record an overall bird assemblage for a site. So I think generally the current acoustic approach is to use in combination with our standard kind of in-person walked surveys. And together, I think they provide a really good kind of comprehensive level of data. We have to bear in mind some species obviously aren't that vocal, and that the data from these acoustic detectors generally won't give you an idea of abundance, which often we'll want to know for impact assessments. But I think a key positive for acoustic surveys is that they provide a standardized approach. So we can have really accurate comparison between years and sites if we use the same detectors in the same locations. So this could be really good for monitoring and for research. One challenge from acoustic surveys has been the very, very large quantity of data. And without automated tools, it simply isn't practical often to analyse them, which I know has certainly been a consideration for us in undertaking acoustic surveys at Biocensus. But analysis tools are becoming more commercially available, and through the likes of the BTO pipeline as well. So within our surveys, we have a few different factors that we need to consider in terms of our approach. As I've mentioned, birds are hugely diverse and our impacts on them can be diverse. And so the methods might need to vary more than perhaps for some other disciplines that you might be familiar with. And that's recognised by the bird survey guidelines. So I won't go into too much detail, but these are some of the factors that you might wish to consider. We might have a lower number of visits, particularly if the site is less suitable, or the impacts are likely to be much reduced. So say temporary small scale works. So we might have, say, 4 breeding bird survey visits rather than 6 where deemed appropriate. The timing and spacing of visits needs to consider your target species. So are there species that are going to be recorded early in the season, maybe like goshawk or lesser spotted woodpecker, or you're going to have some late species, maybe migratory breeders like hobby or honey buzzard, for which later visits are going to be important. If you have a large site, you may need multiple survey areas, so multiple transect routes or vantage points. And when doing that, we need to consider the potential for double counting of birds that might move between different survey areas. We'll need to think about survey buffers quite often. So do we need to also survey land outside of our site boundary? So areas where we could disturb birds in those areas, or could we have barrier effects on birds moving around the landscape? And these buffer areas could be quite large, maybe several kilometres for wind farm projects and species like golden eagle. Obviously, we should be minimising disturbance wherever we can, but for certain species, we may need a survey licence, species like barn owl, for example. And indeed, these surveys generate a very large volume of data. So we need to think about data capture and moving towards GIS-based data capture can make great efficiencies, particularly when it comes to analysis. So finally, that brings us through to having completed our surveys, we have our data, we understand what the impact might be, and we consider mitigation and enhancement options. I'm going to run through a couple of typical scenarios for that. So as I've mentioned, impacts can occur during different development stages, during construction, operation, or decommissioning. They could relate to immediate impacts, so for example, destruction of an active nest, or they could be much more long-term, so say gradual disturbance or habitat degradation resulting in a long-term population decline. Disturbance is indeed a big factor, often during construction, but also during operation, such as through recreational activities. Collisions is a key impact we need to consider with a lot of our schemes, obviously for road, wind and power line schemes, but potentially also for other projects, so solar farms, perhaps solar panels being confused with water bodies as a potential impact. Obviously, habitat loss and alteration is a key potential impact, along with fragmentation, which can create smaller, more isolated populations, which will typically be less resilient, therefore more vulnerable to local decline, or maybe even to local extinction. So there's lots of information available on impacts. Again, I don't have time to go into too much detail, but these are some really useful sources. So when it comes to thinking about disturbance and exclusion zones, which I'm going to discuss in a minute, the Nature Scott Review is a really, really good piece of literature. There's lots of wind farm guidance available. There are some great species dossiers by the Scottish Wind Farm Steering Group, which talk about the distribution and status of key species, their susceptibility to impacts, and knowledge gaps for those species as well, where we could benefit from further research. And as an alternative resource, I thought I'd touch on the BTO's Climate Change and the UK's Birds paper, which is really useful in understanding how climate change could affect different species. Some are expected to have positive impacts, some it's going to be detrimental to. So it's really good specific information and can be useful to thinking about our sites and also to our future baseline, which I know is relevant to our impact assessment process. So we've thought about what the impacts might be, but what mitigation can we provide to minimise and avoid those impacts, and what enhancements might we deliver for birds? Obviously, these are very wide-ranging. As ever, we think about our mitigation hierarchy. So firstly, how can we avoid those impacts? So having input into the development design, I know there are many factors into this, but being part of that conversation can be really useful. Can we retain the best habitats for birds or minimise fragmentation? Can we say bury cables rather than having them erected and therefore posing a collision risk? Could we use a less impactful turbine specification? So these are the sorts of questions that we'd be asking. Could our working methods avoid those key times of year, say the times when our Schedule 1 species are likely to be breeding? Could we use less impactful practices? So could we generate less disturbance when working? Thinking about particularly impacts on nesting birds, can we deter them from areas where they might be affected? So by making the habitat unsuitable, or perhaps introducing deterrents which cause them to avoid those areas. So there's lots of literature on this, and I know lots of you will have had experience of this with your projects. And Des, after his introduction to the call, will attest that this can be quite difficult. Birds can obviously be quite faithful to particular areas. So I think our learnings on this are that you often need a multi-pronged approach. You might need more than one deterrent measure in combination. It's key to vary these measures to avoid habituation rather than keeping one deterrent in place for an extended period, which is unlikely to be effective. And for colonial species, say nesting in large numbers, it may not be possible to deter altogether. It might be a case of reducing numbers. But I think nest deterrence, again, is a key research area and one that the biosensors have been involved with. And then finally, can we create replacement habitat or can we enhance retained habitats? So there's lots of literature on this, the likes of the BTO and the RSPB, species-specific literature from great websites like Operation Turtle Dove. So we need to, within this, consider what species we might be affecting, the species that are already present on site, or maybe species that are present in the wider landscape that we can improve our site for, thinking back to maybe our local BAP priority species or species returned in the desk-based review. We also want to think about what resources are currently lacking from our site. So maybe it's cavity nest sites for species like barn owl, maybe it's water during the hottest times of year for something like turtle dove. I appreciate I'm probably a touch short on time, so I'll go through these fairly quickly, but a couple of examples that many of you will be familiar with will be relevant to you, particularly in the coming weeks and months as well. So active nests at construction sites, many of us will encounter. It helps at the outset if you consider the risk, and this will be informed by your survey data and your desk-based review as well. So which species could nest on your site? What protection are they subject to? So are there any Schedule 1 species, and when would they be breeding? So we want to obviously avoid the most sensitive periods, so works that could disturb or destroy for those other species. Active nests generally between mid-February and mid-September is what we tend to recommend now. But obviously that will depend on the location in the country, the habitat and the species affected. I should add that nesting bird check has become quite a familiar concept, and it may be feasible for small areas of relatively unsuitable habitat, but generally this shouldn't be a go-to solution for larger areas, highly suitable habitat like scrub, woodland, reed beds, where it simply may not be possible to confirm the absence of nests, or it's likely that there'll be so many nests that there'd be so many exclusion zones, so many limitations on construction that it simply wouldn't be feasible. So in those habitats, we need to be working outside of the breeding season or making the habitat unsuitable before the breeding season starts. If it is appropriate to work in the breeding season, we'll undertake monitoring, and if we find active nests, then we'll potentially need to establish an exclusion zone. The factors on the size of the exclusion zone, as I mentioned, there's that excellent NatureScot paper, but there's also a range of other factors that we can consider. So different species obviously have different sensitivities. The level and the type of disturbance to which the birds are going to be subject and how that compares with baseline levels. So if you think about, say, a peregrine nest in central London, you might be able to safely use a much smaller exclusion zone than a peregrine nest in a remote coastal site with very little disturbance. And we'd also want to consider potential barriers between the source of disturbance and the nest, which might enable us to have a smaller exclusion zone. And then we'd maintain this until the nesting attempt is finished or until the young are no longer dependent in the case of those Schedule 1 species. And finally, I'm going to touch on wind farm developments as a development that I'm sure many of you work on and can have particularly significant impacts, especially during the operation stages through collision fatalities or injuries, and also potentially through displacement and barrier effects. There's lots of detailed guidance, including recently updated NatureScot guidance on, I believe, on the survey methods and on collision risk modelling. The species that we often need to consider are larger, mobile, high-flying species, so waterfowl, raptors. Overseas projects might involve species like bustards. And we also want to think about the cumulative effects, so not only from our development, but from the developments around it, bearing in mind that these species can be highly mobile, and therefore several smaller developments could combine to have a really significant effect. For these developments, we want to consider our turbine specifications and where these turbines are positioned, and we want this to be informed by our long-term data. So as I say, we'd like to have bird experts involved in this process, and bearing in mind, therefore, the data requirement for these projects can be quite large, might be several years worth of data. and this might need to cover quite a large buffer outside of your site. And where turbines are going to be in a sensitive location, so potentially on a migration route or maybe near an active nest of a sensitive species, mitigation can be quite challenging, which is why that design stage is important. Some options include curtailment, so we might turn off the turbine at a certain time of day or perhaps a certain time of year when impacts would be greatest. Radar guiding is an option for this, for when targeted to when a bird actually enters the risk area. Well, bear in mind, of course, that curtailment would have a financial implication for that project. And there are also some novel approaches. So, for example, there was a well-publicised project in Norway where painting a blade black reduced collision impacts, or appeared to, on white-tailed eagles. So again, some interesting ideas, but bear in mind the other factors: public opposition to having a black turbine blade. But yeah, lots of interesting areas. So finally, I appreciate that was a lot of information to whirl through, but if you take anything away from that today, I hope the key messages are that birds can be a consideration in varied settings and projects, perhaps beyond those at which some of the other protected species are, even at sites that you might initially think are quite unsuitable. So going back to those pictures of heavily disturbed playing fields, construction sites, for example. So it pays to engage an ornithologist early on, or if you have a potential impact. It's really helpful if people understand the survey methods, at least at a broad level, so they understand the timing of them, when to commission those surveys, and ensure that the right data are collected. And finally, I hope that you engage with birdwork. It's a really interesting field, and continue to learn. And for those with experience or newer to the field, think about our approaches, challenging them. Is there an evidence base for what we're doing, and how can we improve them? So thank you for your time. I hope you found it interesting and informative, and enjoyed the photos. And I'll be happy to take questions. So I think I'll be handing back to Des.
Great, thanks very much, George. We're a little over time, but we can squeeze in a couple of questions. I've got a first one here that appeared on the chat. On the winter bird surveys, the non-breeding scope, are only 4 visits best practice, or should we be recommending 6 as per the breeding bird surveys?
So 4 visits is the best practice approach. So that's typically when we are only concerned with impacts during the core winter season. But for a site which has potential to support migrating birds, or if it's a particularly high suitability site, then we may recommend 6 visits. So you might have 1, say, in late October, then your monthly visits through to February, and then 1 in early March. But there may be scenarios in which more visits are required, particularly thinking about tidal counts for estuarine sites, where we might have 2 visits a month. So again, it's proportionate with the species that you might have and what your impacts might be. But I think the standard approach is 4 visits.
So, but context specific.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the next question is, if you were doing a survey of a short line of trees or some scrub rather than a transect to check for presence, absence of breeding birds, is it still critical to start that survey shortly after dawn?
Yes, it should be. I mean, I guess in that context, it depends whether you're talking about, I guess, a sort of a nesting bird check or a pre-planning survey. If it's just a line of trees, then your survey effort might obviously be greatly reduced. But yes, whenever you're dealing with the majority of breeding bird species, you want to be out at dawn or sometimes slightly before dawn, because that's the period when they're most active and most detectable.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, sorry that to have to bring this to an end. There are several more questions in the chat. We will try to get back to you, or George will try to get back to you by email and answer all of those questions. So it just really remains for me to say thanks, George, for a thoroughly interesting talk, and thanks to all of you for listening. Our next First Thursday Club webinar will be on June the 5th, and that will be on the much discussed and hotly debated subject of the planning and infrastructure bill proposals. What do they mean for development and nature recovery in England? So we look forward to seeing many of you there. So all the best and goodbye until next time.
Thanks, everyone.